Naked Andy just wanted to try something new, but ended up nearly paralyzing his girlfriend. Andy and Jack rushed to the scene after receiving the call. Lisa was standing stiffly in the bathroom corner, wrapped in a bedsheet, with blood pooling at her feet. The paramedics discovered that the showerhead bracket had pierced her lumbar spine. This was the most dangerous erotic accident imaginable. To save her, the firefighters decided to use a saw to cut off the bracket and then take her to the hospital. However, Lisa was terrified at the sound of the saw and asked if they could just pull the bracket out. The deputy captain explained that the bracket was hook-shaped and fixed to the wall. Forcing it out could cause her back pain to escalate into full-body damage, so they had to do it this way. Reluctantly, Lisa had no choice but to accept this rescue method. However, when she saw the saw, she couldn't control her fear. The paramedic noticed her concern and quickly hugged Lisa and let her lean on him. When the paramedic hugged her, Lisa felt as if she had found a human security blanket. Throughout the whole process, Lisa only felt a slight vibration. Soon, the brace was sawed off and Lisa was free. Fortunately, after the rescue, she could walk slightly, and her spine was unharmed. The paramedics used gauze to secure the brace and bandage it, then carefully helped Lisa onto the stretcher and had her lie on her side. Andy now understands that passion requires clarity. Otherwise, an ambulance might become the third wheel in a date. When a bathroom scene turned into an emergency room adventure, another more dangerous game was unfolding on the subway. The little boy was coughing non-stop when the firefighters saw the Baran label on his luggage. Their faces turned as pale as if they had seen their ex-boyfriend, because they had just returned from Baran, where an avian flu outbreak had occurred. Maya was completely panicked. She took off her gloves faster than she would have dumped a bad boyfriend, and immediately contacted the CDC. The CDC expert replied that it was a new strain of avian flu, highly contagious and airborne. Although the CDC had set up a task force, it would take at least 30 minutes to arrive. In the meantime, Maya and Jack had to ensure that the passengers in the subway car remained isolated. However, with only 2 people trying to keep a crowd from panicking, it was like trying to stop a herd of wild horses. Sure enough, a man in a suit couldn't sit still. He questioned the firefighters, asking why they turned off the air conditioning and wouldn't let them get off the train. Other passengers also started to get restless. Maya had no choice but to tell them the truth. They had to carry out an emergency quarantine, and turning off the air conditioning was to prevent the virus from spreading through the air to the outside. Although Maya immediately covered the old woman's mouth with a mask, her words still caused panic among the crowd. The man in the suit continued to stir things up, saying that the boy had been coughing and spitting blood earlier. The man in the suit incited the passengers to escape the quarantine, saying, "This boy is coughing up blood. Do you want to die with him?" Everyone listened in panic, and when the man in the suit saw that the time was right, he encouraged everyone to get off the bus. Instantly, the carriage descended into chaos as passengers followed the man in a suit toward the exit. Jack stood in front of the door, but he was outnumbered and couldn't stop the crowd of people who had lost their minds. As the situation was about to spiral out of control, suddenly, Maya turned around and countered with moral blackmail. "If you go out and infect your families, you'll be the ones responsible for their deaths." At that moment, the crowd finally regained their senses and quietly returned to their seats. The suit-wearing man, like a cat whose tail had been stepped on, had no choice but to pretend to be docile. Seeing this, the 2 firefighters sighed in relief. Fortunately, everyone was civilized. Otherwise, they wouldn't have known how to handle the situation. However, this calm did not last long. A man in a checkered shirt suddenly started coughing, then spat blood and collapsed on the ground. It turned out that there was more than one source of infection in the carriage. The man in the plaid shirt had also been to Baran. He was now suffering from acute respiratory distress syndrome, caused by oxygen deprivation leading to arrhythmia, after a tense rescue and an injection of lidocaine. His symptoms finally eased. The firefighters breathed a sigh of relief, praying that nothing else would happen in the next few minutes. However, what they feared most happened. The boy who had been coughing took a turn for the worse and collapsed on the ground. Maya and Jack rushed over to save him. Judging from the boy's gums, they realized his blood pressure was dropping. They didn't dare to waste any time and immediately began resuscitation. But just as they were focused on saving the boy, the suited man nearby began to stir again. He didn't want to die with this group of people and insisted on leaving this metal coffin. Meanwhile, the rescuers were too busy saving the boy to stop this troublemaker. Just then, the subway security guard shocked the man in the suit with a taser, knocking him to the ground. The security guard seemed satisfied, but his smugness vanished the next moment. The man in the suit was convulsing abnormally at the back of his neck. The security guard panicked. "I'm in big trouble." Jack rushed over to check on the suit-wearing man and found that he had gone into cardiac arrest from the electric shock. He asked Maya for lidocaine, but Maya said they had already used it all up while treating the man in the checkered shirt. Hearing this, the security guard broke out in a cold sweat. Jack comforted him briefly and prepared to go to the ambulance to get the medicine, but Maya stopped him, as they couldn't violate the quarantine regulations. Jack knew that without medicine, the man in the suit would surely die. He put his hopes in the disease control center, but they replied that it would take 10 minutes to arrive. The problem was that the man in the suit might not last that long. Just then, Maya had a brainwave. With so many passengers, Perhaps someone had medicine that could save him, so she asked everyone to take out the medicine they had on them and let her check. While Maya was searching for the medication, the man in the suit stopped breathing. The security guard hurriedly called Jack to save him. Unfortunately, at the same time, the man in the checkered shirt also stopped breathing and needed immediate assistance. Jack was at a loss. The boy under his care was still in critical condition, and he couldn't leave. Jack's mind was racing. What could he do to save everyone? Under tremendous pressure, Jack came up with a bold idea. He wanted to involve these untrained ordinary people in the rescue, and everyone stood up instead of standing idly by. They knew that in the face of a terrible epidemic, they had to unite. Jack asked a passenger to open the first aid kit and find the resuscitation bag, then threw it to the woman in red and told her to follow his instructions to assist the man in the plaid shirt with breathing. He then turned to the boy's father and told him to find anything labeled dopamine. Under the command of 2 firefighters, everyone quickly sprang into action to save the people. Meanwhile, Maya finally found a Miodoron after going through every bottle of medicine handed to her by the old woman. She immediately asked the old woman to take 2 tablets and put them into the man in the suit's mouth. Looking at the boy, his blood volume was too low and he needed an emergency blood transfusion, so his father rolled up his sleeve and became a temporary blood bag. However, the man in the plaid shirt was stuck. No air was getting in no matter how hard they pressed. Seeing the urgent situation, the woman in red disregarded the risk of infection and began performing mouth-to-mouth resuscitation on the stranger. Her daring act paid off, and the man in the plaid shirt's chest began to rise and fall. At the same time, under the effect of the medication, the man in the suit regained consciousness. He cursed and said he would sue them all. But who cared? As long as no one died, it was fine. Soon, the boy also regained consciousness. At this point, all 3 people were out of danger. Finally, Maya and Jack could completely relax. Just then, good news came from the Center for Disease Control. They had arrived at the subway station and set up a quarantine area outside. After examination, Maya and Jack were not infected, and the patients in the subway car gradually recovered after receiving vaccinations. At this moment, both of them felt ecstatic to have survived the ordeal. In fact, at that time in the subway car, they were also afraid of death, but as firefighters, they kept their duties in mind. Not only did they hide their emotions well, but they also did an excellent job of controlling the epidemic and saving 3 lives in a time of crisis. While humans were suspicious of each other in a confined space, a more primitive struggle for survival was taking place in the city sewers. When the boy ran away from home, he encountered police officer Lisa. Unexpectedly, the boy was frightened by her skin color and turned and ran away. Lisa wanted to call him to stop, but instead forced him into a dead end. In his panic, the boy jumped into the sewer, and the rushing water swept him away instantly. Lisa quickly called for backup and asked the firefighters to rush to the scene to save him. Soon, the firefighters arrived at the scene. Captain Mike analyzed the direction and speed of the water flow, as well as the drainage map, to determine the possible route the boy might have taken. He then dispatched firefighters to check every sewer along the route. Finally, their efforts paid off. The boy's handprints appeared on the wall of a sewer pipe. Based on this crucial clue, they identified a manhole where the boy might have passed through. Everyone boarded the fire truck and rushed to the intercept point. The captain instructed Maya to put on her equipment and prepare to enter the water early to rescue the boy. However, the equipment malfunctioned, and there was no oxygen in the oxygen mask. The captain, considering the safety of his team members, strongly demanded that the oxygen equipment be replaced. Just as they turned around, the boys' cries for help echoed from the sewer. What they didn't expect was that Andy had jumped in without any equipment. In the sewer, Andy struggled to grab the boy, but the swift current caused him to lose his balance. By the time he managed to struggle out of the sewage, the boy was nowhere to be seen. Not only had they failed to save the boy, but they now had to spend extra time rescuing Andy. Andy's leap had successfully upgraded the rescue difficulty from hard mode to hell mode. Fortunately, the teammates who stayed behind were quite capable. They checked the map and quickly predicted the next intercept point, which would also be their last chance to rescue Andy. Under the captain's leadership, everyone quickly moved to the new location. But when they arrived at the target location, they were stunned by the scene before them. How were they going to get down into such a small manhole to rescue someone? Time was of the essence, so the captain ordered someone to fetch a hand drill to enlarge the manhole. Jack looked at the narrow well opening and suddenly had a bold idea. He said, "Why don't we let the little boy climb up himself?" Maya was immediately awakened from her dream. She quickly fetched a life ring and threw it into the sewer. At this moment, the boy was leaning against a thin piece of scrap steel to avoid being washed away by the rushing water. The firefighter told him to let go of the steel and grab the life ring, but the boy was too scared to let go. At this moment, the boy's father rushed over and encouraged him to be brave for his sick mother. It turned out that the boy's mother was seriously ill and about to die. Unable to accept this terrible fact, he ran away from home. In the end, the boy's belief in his mother overcame his fear. He jumped against the strong current and finally grabbed the life preserver. When he returned to the ground, He couldn't even believe that he had succeeded. The surrounding crowd erupted in applause, seeing the father and son tightly embracing each other. Andy's heart finally settled. While a young life was struggling in the darkness, an elderly man was paying a heavy price for a minor mistake. The 80-year-old man never imagined that a small piece of wire would cost him his right hand. Fortunately, firefighters patrolling nearby heard his cries for help. They thought the old man would be rescued soon, but unfortunately, the town was surrounded by the Los Angeles wildfires, and the medical team couldn't get in. The old man's wounds were too deep, and although the firefighters tried to stop the bleeding with tourniquets, it wasn't very effective. Soon, he fell into a coma due to excessive blood loss. At that moment, Maya said she could run back to get tools to dismantle the machine and save the old man, but Deke said there wasn't enough time. The elderly man had already gone into shock. By the time they returned with the tools and dismantled the machine, he would likely have already passed away. The two teammates were desperate. What should they do? It turned out that Deke suggested cutting off the elderly man's hand at the wrist to stop the bleeding immediately. This was the only way to save him. Maya accused him of being crazy, reminding him that they were only firefighters. According to regulations, they were only allowed to provide supportive care and transport the patient to the hospital in one piece. But at that moment, they were surrounded by a wildfire. Who knew how long they would have to wait to escape? Seeing the old man's life hanging by a thread, Jake and Maya had no choice but to agree to the amputation. Since the old man's hand bones were already broken, they only needed to cut the tendons connecting them. Soon, the old man was saved, and the bleeding stopped as Deke had predicted. They saved the old man's life. However, after taking him back to the temporary shelter, instead of gratitude from his family, what awaited them was hysterical complaints. At this moment, the old man also woke up. Seeing that he was missing a hand, he broke down. The old man asked Deke, "Who gave you the right to cut off my hand without my permission?" Deke's expression at that moment was like a golden retriever accused of stealing cookies. Seeing this, Maya couldn't take it anymore. She hid in the room and vented her emotions. They had traveled all the way from Seattle to Los Angeles to help fight the fire. Now they were surrounded by wildfires, risking their lives at any moment. And not only that, they had just saved someone only to be harshly blamed. She broke down, feeling that everything was so terrible and hopeless. But just then, a cute little kitten jumped through the window. Jake was overjoyed. This was the kitten that the old man had lost. They had thought the kitten had been burned to death, but now it had miraculously appeared before their eyes. However, soon after, the worst-case scenario they had feared came to pass. The wildfire had reached the door, and they were completely trapped. What should they do now? Were they really going to die here? Just as everyone was at a loss, Maya's phone suddenly rang. It was the chief. He had found a way out for them in the midst of this desperate situation. However, the team was still missing the captain and Andy. They had to find them first. At that moment, the captain and Andy, who had gone out to investigate the disaster, were facing an unimaginable predicament. The wildfire was spreading too quickly, and it was about to engulf them. Fortunately, there was a house with a swimming pool nearby. Without thinking twice, they jumped in before the fire could reach them. After an unknown amount of time, just as they were about to run out of air, the light above them finally grew dim. It seemed they had survived the most dangerous moment. Fortunately, there was an opening nearby. The two rushed over, but everywhere they looked, there was fire and thick smoke. Where should they go next? Just as they were feeling lost, a fire truck suddenly appeared out of the thick fog. It was their teammates coming to rescue them. They had been in constant contact with the chief, who told them to head west and look for a house with a large flower. There was a small road nearby that could be used to escape, but with the thick smoke rolling around, how could they see any large flowers? What was worse was that the high temperature of the fire was about to melt the tires. The fire truck might not be able to hold out much longer. At that critical moment, Andy suddenly remembered that he had seen the house with the large flowers before, and it seemed to be just ahead. Although Andy had seen the house before, he had no idea when to turn to get to the small path. There was no other option, so Maya decided to take a chance. Surprisingly, it actually worked. Everyone shouted in amazement, unable to believe that they had actually survived. After getting out, the old man received proper medical care, while Deke approached awkwardly and returned the wedding ring he had found in the grass to the elderly couple. Looking at the ring, the couple felt a mix of emotions. Although the old man had lost the hand he wore the ring on, at least he was still alive. Meanwhile, Jake was searching for the cat's owner. He said the cat's owner was a cute bald old man and asked the nurse if she had seen anyone matching the description. To his surprise, the nurse said that just moments ago, an old man matching the description had fallen and was now in a coma. Jake was deeply regretful, but just then, the old man embraced the cat he had lost and found again as if he were holding the entire world. Finally, the Los Angeles wildfire was brought under control. The firefighters from Station 19 had done their job and were ready to go home. However, when they returned, Deke found himself in trouble because he had amputated the elderly man's limb without his consent. His superiors were holding him accountable. They accused him of abuse of power, and the promotion and raise he had worked so hard for were now freeze. A major accident has occurred. A fire broke out in an abandoned building, But when firefighters arrived to extinguish it, they turned on the sprinkler system and were surprised to find that it was spraying gasoline. The small flames instantly turned into a raging fire that engulfed several firefighters inside the building. But what exactly happened? It all started when a fire broke out in an abandoned building. When firefighters arrived at the scene, they didn't rush to extinguish the fire. After all, the building was about to be demolished, so there was no need to risk their lives. However, just as they were preparing to watch from a distance, a teammate patrolling the area made a shocking discovery. There were many empty bottles at the base of the wall, and at the entrance, there were numerous cans used for anti-theft alarms. It seemed that someone was living in the abandoned building. Just then, two small vagrants crawled out of the ventilation shaft. One of them was a girl who said there were 5 more inside and urged the firefighters to go rescue them. Andy tried to check on the girl, but she resisted fiercely. Not only that, she crawled back into the burning building, insisting on leading Andy inside. With no other choice, Andy called his teammates to follow her into the building, with the girl leading the way. They quickly found 3 of the homeless children, but 2 were still missing. At this point, the fire inside the building was growing more intense, and they had to control it immediately. Unfortunately, when the team members outside opened the nearby fire hydrant, they found there was no water inside. The situation was critical. What should they do? At that moment, Andy noticed the fire sprinklers on the ceiling. Perhaps they could activate the sprinklers to extinguish the fire. Hearing Andy and his teammates' conversation, the little girl immediately said she knew where the switch was. Without waiting for Andy to react, she ran ahead to lead the way. Sure enough, with the little girl leading the way, they quickly found the switch. Meanwhile, teammate Jake also found the last 2 homeless children. However, the flames were too intense, and they were trapped. Jake called out to Andy, telling him to quickly open the fire sprinkler. However, the moment Andy opened the valve, something strange happened. A single drop of water from the sprinkler caused the flames to explode. At first, Jake thought he had seen it wrong, but then a second drop fell, followed by a third. However, it was too late, as the unknown liquid sprayed everywhere. The flames in the hallway instantly grew. Andy realized something was wrong and quickly closed the valve, but the fire was already out of control and they were all trapped. When the captain outside heard about the accident in the building, he was so anxious that his face turned black. Unfortunately, the dispatch center reported that it would take another 2 minutes to supply water to the fire hydrant. Seeing the severity of the fire, the captain didn't dare to waste any time and immediately grabbed a fire extinguisher and rushed into the building. Thanks to him, he managed to clear a path through the flames, allowing Jake and the others to avoid being engulfed by the fire. However, the captain's equipment was limited, and he could only rescue some of his teammates. Andy and the others were still trapped in the fire, as their oxygen was about to run out and they were about to suffocate. Water finally reached the fire hydrant. Seeing this, the people outside quickly opened the water cannons and sprayed water toward the windows of the building. Finally, the fire was brought under control, and Andy and the others who were trapped were able to escape safely from the fire. Every mission of a firefighter is accompanied by unpredictable dangers, but fortunately, they have teammates they can rely on. This is also the key to why firefighters are able to complete their missions successfully every time. Everyone survived the disaster, but Andy blamed himself. He didn't understand how a fire sprinkler that was in good condition could be filled with gasoline. His action of opening the valve almost killed his teammates. The captain found him and said he had just asked the building owner, who revealed that they had added antifreeze to the water supply system to prevent it from freezing. At that moment, Andy finally breathed a sigh of relief. It seemed he would be able to sleep soundly tonight. When professional rescue efforts were hindered by system failed, 13-year-old Emma came up with an even crazier way to call for help. 13-year-old Emma destroyed half a fire station on her first drive, causing $50 million in direct damage. Emma crashed a fire truck and an ambulance and also knocked over a support beam. But when the firefighters learned about her situation, they didn't blame her. Instead, they asked her with great concern if she was hurt. Emma was terrified and quickly said that she had no choice but to do what she did. Her mother had suddenly suffered an epileptic seizure, and she didn't know what to do, so she drove to the fire station for help. However, she panicked and mistakenly pressed the accelerator instead of the brake, leading to the chaotic situation. Although the process was nerve-wracking, she eventually managed to safely deliver her mother to her destination. The firefighters didn't hesitate and immediately arranged for rescue. But there was a problem. The ambulance had been hit by Emma and couldn't take the patient to the hospital. What should they do? They had no choice but to call a private ambulance. But the problem was that it would take 8 minutes to arrive. Meanwhile, Emma's mother was still convulsing uncontrollably. The firefighters had no choice but to carry her out of the RV and prepare to administer N4 to alleviate her symptoms. However, when they finally managed to carry her out, they discovered that the patient was moving too much to allow the 4 to be inserted. With no other option, the 4 of them worked together to hold the woman down and finally managed to administer the 4. Meanwhile, under the command of the chief, the firefighters used scaffolding to stabilize the twisted roof beam. This prevented the fire station from collapsing. Shortly after, the private ambulance finally arrived at the scene to transfer the woman to the hospital. However, Just as things had stabilized, the woman began convulsing again, this time even more severely. The firefighters immediately prepared to increase the fluid, but the woman's movements caused her to pull the off her neck. Not only that, but she also swung her arm wildly, striking a nearby firefighter. The firefighter was deeply upset. Given the woman's critical condition, she needed to be rushed to the hospital immediately. However, the private medical team refused to take her. The hospital stated that they dared not accept the patient in such a condition, as any damage to the equipment in the ambulance would result in financial liability. With no other options, the firefighters resorted to their last resort. They used a drill to create a hole in the woman's leg and administered intravenous fluids directly into the bone marrow. This method was extremely brutal and would cause the patient immense suffering, so the firefighters were reluctant to use it. However, they had no better options at the moment. To prevent the woman from moving and worsening her pain, they had to deploy 5 firefighters to subdue her. Fortunately, the firefighters were skilled, and the procedure was completed safely. As the medication took effect, the woman's seizures finally subsided, and everyone sighed in relief. Unexpectedly, just as they had solved the big problem, another problem arose. It turned out that Emma had seen the cruel scene of drilling into the bone to administer the infusion. She felt that her mother's suffering was all because she had to raise her sickly self alone, which led to excessive stress and epileptic seizures. She locked herself in the restroom as a way of escaping, thinking that this way she wouldn't have to face the truth. Andy was shocked by her behavior and said, "You're just running away from reality." But as a firefighter, he knew he couldn't hurt a young girl's delicate heart, so he could only gently persuade her to open the door. But Emma was as stubborn as a mule and refused to agree. Andy was at a loss for words, but just then, Emma suddenly rolled her eyes and collapsed straight to the ground. With no other choice, Andy grabbed the fire extinguisher and smashed the glass of his own fire station. According to the medical bracelet on Emma's wrist, she had diabetes. After testing her blood sugar, he diagnosed her with hypoglycemia. Andy quickly injected her with glucose. Soon, Emma finally regained consciousness. But at that moment, he had no idea that the disaster Emma had caused was far from over. It turned out that Emma's mother had installed a gas cylinder in the RV for convenience. Unfortunately, while clearing the debris from the car accident, the firefighters accidentally cut the gas pipe. A large amount of gas leaked out, and unfortunately, the severely damaged phone from the car accident sparked sparks. Thus, the already chaotic fire station faced another crisis. Fortunately, this was a fire station. Personnel and fire extinguishers were readily available. The firefighters had to get back to work, huffing and puffing as they began extinguishing the fire. Meanwhile, Emma was still distraught over her mother's situation. Andy said, "It's not your fault. All you need to do now is go to the hospital and take care of your mother." Finally, these words moved Emma. That night, the firefighters experienced the triple thrill of being emergency doctors, demolition crews, and psychologists. While humans were scrambling in the midst of disaster, nature was showcasing its even more ruthless destructive power. A large forest fire broke out in Los Angeles. Unexpectedly, even though the fire was burning right in front of him, the old man refused to leave. The firefighters were shocked. The old man was willing to risk his life for a cat. But seeing the old man's determination, Jake had no choice but to promise him, "I swear on my life that I will find your cat." Looking at Jake's honest and kind face, the little old man was finally convinced. The firefighters thought that such an elderly person was already a rare exception who wasn't afraid of death. But little did they know that the next 2 elderly people were the true heroes. Even though the wildfire had already reached their heads, they remained calm and said, "You outsiders from Seattle are overreacting. We've lived here for 80 years, and wildfires come every 10 years or so. But every time, it's been a close call but no harm done. I can guarantee this time will be no different." The old man spoke with such conviction that the firefighters were left speechless. However, the old man was soon proven wrong. Ashes rained down from the sky, burning a hole in his clothes. The old man was stunned. This had never happened before. As more sparks flew, the old man could only call the firefighters to help him put out the fire. The Seattle firefighters had never seen anything like this before. They couldn't understand how the wildfire could be thousands of meters away and still burn so close. When they looked up, they saw that the wildfire had suddenly closed in within a minute. It turned out that the wind had suddenly changed direction and blown the wildfire this way. Only then did the old man start to panic. This wildfire was far beyond his imagination. However, the dispatch center reported that all escape routes had been blocked by the wildfire. "You should find a nearby place to take shelter." Hearing this, the old woman panicked and scolded the old man for being reckless. Suddenly, she started bleeding from her nose, and her asthma, which hadn't flared up in years, also returned. The old man was heartbroken and quickly helped her into the house to rest. Considering that the fire would soon reach them, the old man had to go out to clear the bushes around the house. However, he never expected that the lawn mower, which had always worked normally, would malfunction at that moment. The old man panicked and reached out to fix it, which led to this tragedy. When a huge disaster engulfs a home, even a small accident in the kitchen requires professional rescue. Just now, firefighters received a rescue call about a woman who dropped her wedding ring while washing vegetables. She panicked and reached out to pick it up, but it got stuck in the garbage disposal. Although she turned off the machine in time, the intense pain in her hand told her that her finger was likely lost. However, her daughter, who was nearby, acted as if nothing had happened and continued playing mobile games. The three firefighters, on the other hand, had a completely different attitude. They comforted the woman with gentle words and quickly figured out how to disassemble the machine. The daughter, however, found her mother's actions annoying and impatiently asked, "Since there's a group of firefighters here handling this, can I go out and play?" The mother didn't expect her daughter to raise her hand before leaving, indicating she wanted to post her embarrassing moment on social media. Before she could react, she noticed a tattoo on her daughter's wrist. The mother was furious and started lecturing her, but the daughter was impatient and turned on the machine. Seeing her mother scream in pain, she laughed happily, and the mother seemed to have gotten used to it. She didn't blame her daughter but was worried that the tattoo on her wrist might be infected. "I asked the firefighters to check if my daughter's tattoo was infected." The firefighters looked at each other in disbelief. What a loving mother. After checking, the tattoo on her daughter's wrist was indeed slightly inflamed, but it wasn't serious. "Just apply some antibiotic ointment." At this point, Jake couldn't hold back anymore and said, "Your mother is in such pain, yet you're worried about whether your tattoo is inflamed? You have such a good mother, don't you know any better?" Meanwhile, the firefighters' rescue efforts were still making no progress. At this moment, the mother couldn't hold back her tears. Her lover was not by her side, and her daughter was treating her like this. She felt like she was a joke. Just as she was about to break down, the firefighters finally removed the crusher and freed her hand. Although it was bloody and mangled, all 5 fingers were still there. In the end, this family proved that sometimes it's not fingers that need to be crushed, but the wall of ice between generations.
Sorry about the tattoo, Mom.
Oh, baby. Not as sorry as you're gonna be a year from now.